Kia ora, Gertrude. Thank you. Kia ora koutou, ngā mihi kia koutou. I'm Alina. I'm based in Wellington, New Zealand today. And funny that you should mention your TED Talk, Gertrude, because that is actually where I want to start. And I am listening for the last 45 minutes or so. I've completely changed the story that I was going to tell today. And I feel called to tell a slightly different one. So do excuse me if this seems a little unrehearsed. So I've just jotted it down in the last few minutes. So in mid-2012, I had been invited to do a TED Talk in Christchurch, New Zealand. And I was speaking on my journey in spoken word poetry and how poetry and authentic storytelling can help inspire behavior change and shift attitudes. And I sent the draft to the TED Talk speaker, the speaker coach rather, mid-2012 or so. And when I sent the draft to him, I knew that it was missing something. I knew that it wasn't quite right there. And that it was, there was something missing. And he emailed me back within a few hours. And he called me out on something that I had been trying to omit from my TED Talk. And at some stage in the TED Talk, I had hinted at something crazy going on in my life, and things were shifting for me and a lot was changing. And then I kind of just moved on to the next part of the talk, and he said, "What's going on here? Why is it that you're not at what's going on here? What was the crazy thing? What were you learning about yourself?" And the scary thing that I was very much trying to avoid was coming out as gay to an audience of about 700 people for the first time. And also, of course, to anybody that might find the talk on the internet in the future. The irony was that I was doing this talk about authentic storytelling, and here I was trying to hide a very big part of my authentic story. But I had come to terms with that part of my story in my late 20s. So I think I knew as a teenager, but I buried that part of myself for about 10 years. I grew up in a religious home, so that was very much at odds with what I was starting to feel was true about myself. And so I hid that story. And when I started telling that story and started to be public about it, around the same time was when I discovered the spoken word or slam poetry community where I was living in Canada, in the prairies in Saskatchewan. And my poetry journey and my coming out journey are very much intricately intertwined. And it was the discovery of that sort of a supportive community where people get up on stage and tell their stories to each other through the medium of poetry, that helped me really step into my own story and heal some of those traumas of my past and the wounds of my past. So it was only about 8 months that I was in that community before I moved back to New Zealand, but it had struck me as such a profound thing, with people coming to the stage and sharing all sorts of tales of heartbreak and loss, and tales of miscarriage, and all sorts of really vulnerable things that people were sharing with each other. But I had been so moved by it that I committed on stage that if I didn't find a spoken word poetry community wherever I ended up back in New Zealand, that I was going to start one. And so I made that public commitment in front of about 100 people. And I think if I hadn't done that, I probably wouldn't have done what I did when I got to Wellington. But I spent a little while, about a year, looking at all the different poetry events that were happening around the city. Didn't find quite the same vibe that I had had in Canada. And so I started a community called Poetry in Motion, of people coming together and sharing their poems with each other once a month. And from there, I got very much involved in poetry. I won the New Zealand National Poetry Slam later in 2012, and got the experience of going over to Minneapolis to compete in the Women of the World Poetry Slam, which is a fantastic event, but absolutely misnamed, because the event is the Women of North America plus me poetry slam. So I was I was literally the only person that hadn't come from the North American continent, which was really interesting. But increasingly, I found that poetry started intersecting in my more professional life as a communications specialist. And so I ended up working with a international fellowship program that brings impact-driven entrepreneurs and investors and artists and creatives and other innovators to New Zealand, called the Edmund Hillary Fellowship. And part of what really got me that job was the fact that the founders had seen some of my poetry online and said, we want you to bring that style of creative communication into the organization. And that was a bit of a surprise to me, and even a bigger surprise to my mother when I called her up and told her that that little poetry hobby of mine had got me a real job. And so yeah, from there, I found myself performing in places where I wasn't so used to performing. So to date, I had done, gigs in mostly in bars, a few in schools, museums, and had an audience which, by and large, I think were probably pretty on board with most of my messages. And a lot of my poetry is about social and environmental change. And so I started performing at events like conferences or summits of leaders coming together, which was a very different audience, and it was very intimidating to begin with, thinking, this room is full of government people from big corporate organizations. I don't know if my work is going to resonate with them. But I'll just get up there and speak my truths. And I found after one particular performance, a bit with the poem that covered about 75,000 years of humanity's history in 4 minutes, but was also themed about climate change, that afterwards I had about 3 or 4 older white gentlemen in suits come up to me with tears in their eyes. And I thought to myself, this is, these are not the people that I have in my mind when I think of, my message landing. And I had a giggle to myself and thought, if I can make old white men cry, then I'm onto something here. So that was a big game-changing moment for me, and really taught me also a lot about othering and about not putting people in these boxes. And more, I think I've realized that by telling our own authentic stories and facilitating and enabling others to tell their authentic stories, we can start to begin healing collective traumas that I see, and helping to solve some of the biggest issues that I see in the world around inequality and climate change and poverty and the COVID situation that we find ourselves with, and particularly around polarization. And that is the big thing that is worrying me at the moment, is political polarization. And I'm very interested in the role of storytelling and critically the role of what I'm calling story listening to and authentic listening to help create bridges between different people. And I thought I would finish my talk with a poem in a minute, which speaks to that theme. And it's also a theme that very much features. I've been writing a book this year, and I'm hoping to publish that book in early 2021 next year. I'm expecting comments back from my editor on the first draft later today. So I'll know in the next week or so how much work there is still to do there. But it is about narrative and storytelling in order to support long-term systems change. So yeah, wonderful to be here. Thank you, Gertrude, for inviting me. And I would love to finish up on a poem. Just have a wee drink.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Okay. If we are to believe the stories that dominate our newsfeed, there are an evil group of people out there who are out to destroy our lives. They do not share our values. They have no common sense. They will take away your freedom, bombard you with fake news, brainwashing your children with their propaganda. They will do everything in their power to take away all that you hold sacred. Beware. They are out there, the people we call them. Them, the enemy. Them, those other ones. Them, the ones we must overcome, the target of every comment section everywhere. So confident are we that we are the ones who are right. We have turned respectful public debate into millions of miniature individual dictatorships of the mind. The teeth of our savage soundbites grows ever sharper by the day, while indignant ears grow deaf to anything that does not reinforce our worldview. There is no room for reason in a lynch mob. No longer a gift in give and take, no space for context and complexity in a 280 character tweet. The air is growing thin in this here echo chamber. It's getting harder and harder to breathe. We need not even look too far before we can identify a them. Even amongst brothers and sisters in arms, sibling rivalry cuts deep. The climate activist questions the urgency of queer rights if we have no habitable planet to call our home. The unionist challenges foreign aid when a working wage can't even feed our own people. We hear it's the immigrants who are the problem, or those people in SUVs. No, it's the dairy farmers, the greenies, the feminists, the TERFs, the bankers, the church, the NRA. It's corporate welfare, guerrilla warfare. It's the liberal media, the gay agenda. It's them, it's they, it's those people. If only they would stop. Listen. Can you hear that? That is the sound of singular stories. It is the sound of petty distractions. It is the sound of red herrings gasping for breath as the future slips away. Oblivious to our own hypocrisy and wasting our precious energy, we are setting ourselves on fire in the hopes that they will die of smoke inhalation. It need not be like this. We can be better than this. We have the cure for them. It's simple. It is us. What if we took our pointing fingers and we turned them upside down to extend the gentle hand of compromise? Offered up our gifts and contributions with open hearts, embracing grace and humility. It's not to say that we should deny the role of privilege, ignore the wounds from the past, or cease to pursue our passion for change. After all, even the Buddha taught non-violence, not pacifism. But let us dismantle systems of oppression without creating carbon copies addressed to them. Step away from the militancy you've held so close as a lover. Soften your heart and walk a mile in shoes that do not fit. Shoes that cause you discomfort, blisters edging their way in beneath the soles of the feet you have so firmly planted in the arguments you've convinced yourself are solid. This place is familiar. It is comfortable. But we desperately need to stand upon common ground. For it is there that we can pinpoint the underlying causes behind our addiction to outrage. Feelings of grief, of losing that which we hold dear. Feelings of fear, of those who we do not understand. Feelings of pain, of leaning into the despair, of not knowing how the hell we are going to get ourselves out of this mess. Respect the collective wisdom that comes from listening to many voices that are different from your own. Find your passion, and then you do you and do it well, or simultaneously seeking to understand and respect why it is that they care so deeply about something else. According to particle physics, we exchange 98% of the atoms in our body with the world around us every year. So I am you, and you are me, and they are us, and we are them. We are them. We are them. To somebody, somewhere, you are them. Kia ora, thank you.